Good morning. My name is Cameron Miller, and this is Trinity Place in Geneva, New York. And this is a reflection on the third Sunday of Easter season. And this is the last line of our liturgical reading, a poem, Fisherman, by Francis Harvey. When he trawled so wide, he should have trawled deeper. Oh, heck yes. Jesus trawled way too wide and would have done much better with fewer, less ambivalent and feckless disciples like us. Jesus is such a good dude in this story from John. Here he was, a dead man who had just endured unimaginable pain and suffering from torture and execution by a nasty Roman overlord. And despite all of that, he cooks breakfast for his friends on the beach. Now, who does that? The only other thing I want to note about this odd little ghost story from the Gospel of John is what a sweet thing Jesus does for Peter. He leads poor, hapless Peter by the nose through a three-peat, I love you. This gave Peter the opportunity to make up for his three-time repudiation of Jesus on the eve of his execution. Jesus is essentially reconciling with and restoring Peter with a fail-proof public process that even Peter couldn't screw up. And the command that he makes to Peter to feed my sheep, feed my sheep, feed my sheep, then bestows leadership upon Peter that no one can then later deny. Well, this breakfast on the beach story ties up an uncomfortably loose end left over from a bad night that left Peter a coward and a turncoat. But after breakfast on the beach, everything's okay, and all the parties are rejoined and renewed and in community around a campfire and a fish fry. Ichthys, the Greek word for fish, ichthys, quickly became the primary symbol for early Christians. As we know, they turned it into an acronym because each letter was the first letter of their proclamation. So I for Jesus, C for Christ, this is in Greek, H for of God, Y for Son, and S for Savior. So Ichthys is the acronym for Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. I found this little quote in Christianity Today from the 2nd century theologian Tertullian, who said, "We, little fishes, after the image of our ichthys, Jesus Christ, are also born in the water." So today we have the chalice and the cross and the crucified Jesus and the silhouette of a steeple as familiar symbols of Christianity. But in those first generations, it was a fish. Fish were part of the feeding of the 5,000 story, obviously. Fish were the livelihood of the disciples before Jesus and afterwards as well. Fish were the sign of the first simple, ordinary miracle when Jesus first encountered Peter, James, and John, the sons of Zebedee. Just like the story we heard today, in that first encounter, they had been fishing all night and gotten skunked. Jesus tells them where and how to fish, and their nets become so full it causes the boats to capsize from so much abundance. Get it? Capsizing from abundance? He was going to turn their lives upside down with more abundance than they had ever known or could stand. Fishing is what Jesus promised the disciples that they would be doing from now on. only it was fishing for people. So fish, not the cross, began as the primary symbol for Christians. And as you know, it was both a secret symbol to help people avoid discovery and persecution, as well as a public one found on rings and seals and other archaeological evidence of those early Christians. And it makes perfect sense that it would take well over a century for the cross to become distant enough in time from the crucifixion for it not to be a severe trigger of a historic wound. Plus, they were evangelizing Romans for whom the cross was a positive symbol of their geographic dominance. But also, what was it that made Christians Christian? It was baptism. It was immersion in water. We little fishes, after the image of our ichthys. So, that's really all I want to say about fish today for now. Aren't you glad? I could go on. But I want to talk about grief instead. On some level, whether subliminally or not, the Breakfast on the Beach story is a grief story. It's the kind of story that anyone who has ever lost someone they love has dreamt about. You know those kind of dreams, right? You know, in the aftermath of a death in which we see or speak to the dead, and it's all mixed up and highly symbolic and a kind of weird dream, and you wake up and suddenly remember that you were having breakfast or something with your mom or your dad or your spouse or your friend who is dead, and maybe they've been dead for a long time. You sort of shake your head and go on about your day, and maybe you don't even tell anybody about your dream. It's that kind of dream I'm talking about. I dare say that these days we're all carrying around a lot of grief, extra grief even. We've recently lost a good friend here in this congregation, but many of us have lost others during the pandemic, whether from the virus or things related to the virus. Other deaths too that just came like a thief in the night. And then we were shut away from each other in our grief and hadn't had a chance to grieve together. These past 2 years are a very weird season indeed. So much has been stacked up like a pile of pancakes that we kept in the shed. Dreams have died. Things we had once hoped to do, but now seem unlikely. Hopes have died. Beliefs and expectations that have kind of disappeared unexpectedly and really without warning. This war in Ukraine is not only grievous for the bodies that lay spread out and akimbo across hundreds of miles, it's also a war in Europe that's pulling other countries around the world into the war itself in a way that we thought would never happen again. And also, whatever your politics are, I'm guessing that they haven't been entirely satisfied, and that whatever we happen to think is ahead, it probably doesn't appear like a shining city on a hill. I don't really need to tick down the list of familial and relational and social and institutional and international environmental kind of losses that feel grievous to us. All I need to do is point in that direction, and it will likely evoke the shadow of loss. Whether it's for a family or a family member or a friend, or it's our confidence and pride in someone or something, or hope for the future, or casualties from the past. Losses have stacked up like cordwood. Now, some of you know I was in Ohio last week officiating at the memorial service for friends who died during the shutdown, and this was the first best opportunity to say goodbye, at least in person and together. And as I said on Holy Thursday, grief and thanksgiving for a life is something we simply have to do with other people. Doing it alone simply heightens our sense of loss and helps grief to burrow like a wormhole inside of us. Now, I have some personal experience with this I'll share that I may even have mentioned before, and that you know if you've read any of my poetry. In my 50s, I hit a real tough grease lick of depression, and I took a pretty good emotional fall with it. And I discovered that it was about much more than my dad's death, and as this depression sort of happened in the aftermath of that. Like any priest or person in a caring profession, I was caring for people who were dying or who had lost those that they loved. And I had been doing it for almost 30 years. And I came to realize in the midst of this depression, and thanks to therapy, as well as a bunch of grieving, that I had not been processing my own grief along the way. I don't think it was an inflated sense of my own strength, or that I didn't think I needed to grieve. My job was to care for other people, and I hadn't learned yet to step aside at appropriate moments and process my own grief. And honestly, it wasn't. It was just a simple lack of self-awareness, I think, and a kind of ordinary proclivity for denial. But whatever the cause is, unprocessed grief can distort reality and turn the world inside out and turn ourselves inside out too. When we do not get to share our grief with other people, for whatever reasons and for whatever loss, it buries itself in us, and it comes out later in unhealthy and even self-destructive ways. Grieving together, sharing the pain of our losses and working toward recovery with others is just how we get better. That's just how we do it, and how we keep from being injured by our grief. Because, you know, grief is not the enemy. Isolation and undue privacy is. Grieving our losses is good. It's natural. It's healing. We just need to do it fully and out loud with other people. Now, Reverend David Heffling from St. John's Episcopal Church in Canandaigua and I were together reinterring 4 people from the Trinity Columbarium this past week into the columbarium at St. John's Canandaigua. I didn't know them, so I wasn't grieving for them. But removing all those ashes from the Trinity Geneva Columbarium last summer and fall, with as much help and appreciation for the help that was given by John and Dan, was a kind of grievous experience. I wasn't grieving for my own because I didn't know those people. But it was a grieving for the generations of Trinity members, 200 years worth, who rubbed their prayers in the pews and whose prayers were lifted up into the rafters and are still there. Some of the people here in this congregation today are some of those people. Interring those ashes this past week reminded me of all of what might have been, what could have been, what was hoped for but had never happened, all the regrets too, the sorrows and the songs, all of it a loss, a grief, not mine so much as theirs or yours. There's no deep theological point here. I'm not trying to make a statement of faith. No moral to John's story, at least not exactly. What I'm doing is inviting us to be more mindful of what we're going through alone and together, and that we need one another and a sense of community to work through it all. We have no idea what the next few years will shake out, economically, politically, institutionally, in Geneva, for Trinity Place, the nation, internationally, your hometown, your community. We just don't know. But when facing that kind of uncertainty and trying to heal from the losses we've had, holding hands and touching hearts is awfully healing. So let's not downplay or forget about our grief for all kinds of losses, for all kinds of things that have happened or not happened in these past few years. And instead, let us touch our grief as we hold hands in community and give thanks for the abundance we have had and continue to share. You are part of the abundance of this place and part of my abundance. So I thank you for sharing in community, even though it's this way, but this is a good way. So thank you so much. We'd love to hear from you. Peace be with you.